Tonight's tale comes from the fever-soaked lowlands of Louisiana, where the Mississippi runs thick with secrets. This is a story whispered in plantation kitchens, a warning passed down through generations about what happens when a man learns to value everything except his own humanity. In the autumn of 1859, a leather-bound ledger arrived at Riverside Plantation by steamboat from New Orleans. The merchant who delivered it barely glanced at Marcus Holloway as he signed for the package, but had he looked closer, he might have noticed how Marcus's hands trembled as he broke the wax seal. Inside were numbers. Just numbers. But numbers have a way of speaking louder than screams. Marcus Holloway was 43 years old that year, with the kind of face that had once been called handsome but now looked merely worn, like a coin passed through too many hands. His plantation stretched along the river bend. Not the grandest estate in Louisiana, but respectable. 200 acres of cotton, a modest house with columns that needed paint, and 18 souls he claimed as property. What the ledger showed him that October evening would have broken a lesser man immediately. Perhaps it would have been mercy if it had broken Marcus too. He owed $8,000 to the New Orleans banking house, another $3,000 to seed merchants. The cotton blight of '58 had taken half his crop, and the gambling, the gambling, had consumed the rest. The mathematics were simple and damning. By spring, the bank would seize everything unless he found a way to generate $500 a month, every month, for 2 years. Marcus sat in his study that night, the lamplight casting his shadow long and bent across the wall. His wife, Constance, knocked once, but didn't enter when he didn't answer. His daughters, Margaretta, 19, Louisa, 17, and young Beatrice, just 15, laughed somewhere in the house, their voices bright with ignorance of the abyss opening beneath their feet. It was in that moment, staring at those numbers, that something in Marcus Holloway began to change. Not all at once. Evil rarely announces itself. It seeps in slowly, like river water through a cracked levee. 3 days later, a man arrived at Riverside Plantation without invitation or announcement. He gave his name as Mr. Sebastien, though whether that was his Christian name or family name, he never clarified. He wore a gray suit that looked expensive and shoes that had never touched mud, somehow remaining pristine despite the long road from the city. "I heard you might be interested in creative financial solutions," Mr. Sebastien said, sitting uninvited in Marcus's study. His accent was French, or perhaps Creole, something that suggested he belonged to that shadowy world between cultures that thrived in New Orleans. "I'm not interested in anything illegal," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. Mr. Sebastien smiled. "Nothing I propose violates any law, of Louisiana or the United States. The law, Mr. Holloway, is a beautifully precise instrument. It says exactly what it says and nothing more." He laid out papers on Marcus's desk, birth certificates, baptismal records, all blank, waiting to be filled. "The law of partus, sequitur, ventrem is quite clear," Mr. Sebastien continued, his fingers tracing the Latin words. "The child follows the condition of the mother. If the mother is enslaved, the child is property, regardless of the father's status. But here's what most people don't consider. Documentation determines reality. If the paperwork says a child belongs to an enslaved woman, who would question it?" Marcus understood immediately, and in understanding, felt something inside him, some last guardian of his conscience, begin to die. "I couldn't," he whispered, but he was already calculating. "A healthy infant," Mr. Sebastien said softly, "sells for $300 in the New Orleans market, sometimes more, depending on complexion. I handle all transactions, 20% commission, no questions asked, no connections traced." After Mr. Sebastien left, Marcus sat motionless until dawn. When Constance found him in the morning, she said his eyes looked different, darker, like something had moved behind them and never moved back. The changes began subtly. Marcus started taking inventory of his household with a merchant's eye, not seeing people, but assessing assets. He made trips to New Orleans more frequently, returning with medical texts and what he called agricultural journals, but which dealt with topics No gentleman should study so intently. His daughters noticed how their father watched them now during meals, his gaze lingering in ways that made them uncomfortable. Margaretta mentioned it to her mother once, but Constance dismissed it as stress over finances. How could she imagine the truth? What mother could? Marcus began making modifications to the servants' quarters, creating separate rooms with locks on the outside. When the overseer, a man named Josiah, questioned these changes, Marcus dismissed him and hired someone new, a brute from the river docks who asked no questions and showed no mercy. It was in December that Marcus called Margaretta to his study. She came willingly, expecting perhaps to discuss the Christmas celebration or her upcoming debut in society. Instead, her father explained, in clinical detail, what would be required of her to save the family from ruin. Margaretta's screams could be heard throughout the house. Constance ran to the study, but found the door locked. When Marcus finally emerged 3 hours later, his face was pale but set with terrible determination. "She'll understand eventually," he told his wife. "They all will. I'm saving this family." But Constance had seen Margaretta's face when she finally left the study, and she knew that whatever had been discussed had broken something fundamental in their eldest daughter. What followed was methodical. Marcus approached his plan with the same diligence he once applied to crop rotation and livestock breeding. He kept records in a second ledger, hidden behind a false panel in his study. Dates, names, projected values. This book was written in a cipher of his own devising, numbers and symbols that would mean nothing to a casual observer. The enslaved people of Riverside Plantation began to notice changes too. Sarah, a woman who worked in the big house, found herself subject to invasive examinations. A young man named Elijah was moved to a special cabin and given orders that made his skin crawl. Others were threatened into silence with promises of being sold south, where conditions were even worse. Marcus used debt, fear, and the absolute power of his position to construct a machine of horror that ran with terrible efficiency. The first infant was born in March 1860, Margaretta's child. The girl barely survived the delivery, attended only by Sarah under Marcus's supervision. The baby was taken immediately, and 3 days later, Mr. Sebastien arrived to collect it. Marcus received $320. He recorded the transaction in his hidden ledger, then went to church that Sunday and prayed with his neighbors. The second child came in June, this time from Sarah herself, forced into a union that violated every law of God and man, but none of the laws of Louisiana. That baby brought $275. By the end of 1860, Marcus Holloway had generated over $2,000 through his abhorrent system. He made his monthly payments to the bank. He attended social functions and was praised for his financial recovery. He was called shrewd, industrious, a model of Southern ingenuity. No one knew that he had become something worse than a slave owner. He had become a farmer of his own blood, harvesting his children and grandchildren as if they were cotton. Dr. Edmund Thorne was the first to suspect something was deeply wrong at Riverside Plantation. Called to attend to medical matters, he noticed too many pregnancies, too much fear in the eyes of the women, too much control exerted by Marcus over every aspect of his household. But Dr. Thorne also noticed the generous payments Marcus made for his discretion, and Dr. Thorne had debts of his own. "I cannot in good conscience," he began once, but Marcus cut him off. "You can and you will, unless you'd like me to mention to the medical board about your fondness for laudanum, or that incident with the merchant's wife last spring." Dr. Thorne left without another word. He continued making his visits and filing his reports that said nothing at all. The local sheriff, a man named Whitfield, made periodic rounds through the area. Once he heard crying from one of the locked rooms in the servants' quarters. Marcus explained it away as a slave woman in labor, a difficult birth. Whitfield nodded and left. He didn't want to know more. None of them did. This was the true horror. Not that Marcus did what he did, but that he did it surrounded by people who could have stopped him and chose not to. Every person who took his money, who accepted his thin explanations, who chose not to see what was plainly visible. They all built the walls of the prison in which his victims suffered. Constance knew. Of course she knew. How could a wife not know? But she told herself it was impossible, that Marcus couldn't, and in telling herself these lies, she became complicit in every crime. Louisa Holloway lasted longer than her sister before she broke. Margaretta had retreated into silence, spending her days staring at nothing, speaking only in whispers. But Louisa fought. She screamed, she pleaded, she tried to run. Marcus locked her in her room for a week with only bread and water. When she emerged, something essential had been carved out of her. She no longer fought. She simply obeyed, moving through her days like a ghost. Young Beatrice watched her sister's transformations with growing horror. At 15, she understood what awaited her. She begged her mother to send her away to relatives, to a convent, anywhere. But Constance, paralyzed by her own cowardice and complicity, did nothing. The enslaved people of Riverside Plantation suffered their own torments. Elijah, forced to participate in acts that violated every fiber of his being, began to lose his mind. He was found one morning in his cabin, having carved deep gashes in his arms, trying to let the sin out. Sarah tried to organize resistance among the other slaves, but Marcus discovered the plot. He didn't sell her south. That would have lost him a valuable resource. Instead, he made an example of her friend Ruth, selling her to a plantation in the deepest bayou country, a place from which no one ever returned. By the spring of 1862, Riverside Plantation had become a place where hope went to die. The house itself seemed to absorb the suffering, its walls holding in secrets that would rot the very foundations. The Civil War reached Louisiana in 1862, bringing chaos and opportunity in equal measure. Federal gunboats appeared on the Mississippi. Confederate troops moved through the countryside, conscripting men and confiscating supplies. The old order was collapsing. Marcus saw only how this might help hide his crimes. With law and authority breaking down, with records being lost or destroyed, he could operate even more freely. He increased the pace of his operations, becoming more careless in his desperate need to extract maximum profit before the world he knew ended completely. But war creates strange alliances. As plantation society fractured, the rigid hierarchies that had kept everyone in their place began to crack. It was Elijah who first spoke to Constance directly, catching her alone in the garden one evening. The social prohibition against a slave addressing a white woman directly should have been absolute, but these were no longer ordinary times. "Mrs.," he said, his voice low and urgent, "you got to know what's happening here. You got to know what he's doing to your daughters, to all of us." Constance wanted to run, to maintain her willful ignorance, but something in Elijah's eyes, a desperate humanity that mirrored her own buried conscience, made her stop. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me everything." And he did. In the fading light of that April evening, Elijah laid bare every horror, every crime, every child torn from its mother's arms and sold like livestock. He told her about Margaretta's pregnancies, about Sarah's suffering, about the ledger hidden in Marcus's study that documented it all in cold, precise numbers. When he finished, Constance vomited in the rose bushes. Then she wept. Then finally, she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years: rage. The plan they formed was simple. War had taught everyone that sometimes violence is the only answer to violence. Marcus had a routine. Every Thursday, he rode to a neighboring plantation to play cards, returning late at night along the river road. The route was isolated, perfect for ambush or accidents. On the night of June 3rd, 1862, Constance gave her husband a bottle of her father's best whiskey before he left. Marcus, pleased by this apparent gesture of wifely affection, drank deeply from it during the card game. He didn't know that Constance had laced it with laudanum stolen from Dr. Thorne's medical bag. By the time Marcus started his ride home, he was barely conscious in the saddle. At the darkest part of the river road, where ancient oaks blocked even starlight, Elijah and 2 other men waited. They didn't make it quick. For what Marcus had done, they reasoned, he deserved to feel fear, to understand what it meant to be helpless and at someone else's mercy. When they finished, they weighted his body with stones and chains and dropped it in the deepest part of the river, where the current runs dark and fast. The horse was led back to the plantation, injured but alive, suggesting its rider had fallen in the darkness. The sheriff found bloodstains on the river road the next morning. He concluded Marcus had been thrown from his horse, struck his head, and wandered confused into the river. It was a plausible story. These things happened. No one looked too closely. No one wanted to. Constance found the hidden ledger 3 days after Marcus's funeral. She sat in his study for hours, reading through the cipher she had long ago learned to decipher. Marcus was predictable in his secrets. The numbers were there. Every child, every transaction, every dollar of blood money, written in her husband's precise hand, as if he were recording nothing more sinister than cattle sales. She carried the ledger to the fireplace and burned it, page by page, watching the paper blacken and curl. She burned the other documents too, the forged certificates, the letters from Mr. Sebastien, every piece of evidence. Some might call this destroying proof of crimes. Constance called it mercy for the victims, who deserved not to have their suffering recorded in Marcus's neat handwriting for posterity. With the ledger burned, she gathered her daughters and the enslaved people of Riverside Plantation in the main house, a shocking breach of social convention that would have scandalized her neighbors. But she no longer cared about convention. "You are all free," she announced. "I am signing papers of manumission for everyone. The plantation is being sold, and the proceeds will be divided equally among all of us, including every person Marcus held in bondage." Some of the slaves wept, others simply left, unable to trust that this wasn't another form of torture. Margaretta and Louisa, both pregnant with children they would finally be allowed to keep and raise, held each other. Beatrice, spared by fate from the worst of her father's plans, vowed to never marry, never have children, never give any man the power Marcus had wielded. Riverside Plantation was sold in 1863 to a cotton merchant from Memphis. The new owner noticed strange things: rooms that remained cold even in summer, doors that wouldn't stay locked, a persistent crying sound in the night that no one could locate. They lasted 2 years before abandoning the place, claiming the house was cursed. The husband swore he saw figures moving in the old servants' quarters, women holding bundles that might have been babies, walking in endless circles. The house stood empty for decades, slowly returning to the earth. The river claimed some of the land. Trees grew through the floorboards. The columns that had once needed paint simply fell over one by one, like soldiers surrendering to time. By 1900, nothing remained of Riverside Plantation except stories. Locals avoided the area, claiming they could hear crying on still nights. Children dared each other to walk through the ruins at midnight, though none ever did. Constance died in 1891 in a small house in Baton Rouge, surrounded by her daughters and their children, the grandchildren she had saved. She never spoke publicly about what happened at Riverside Plantation, though she kept a journal that was found after her death. Her last entry, written the week before she died, read, "I wonder if God will forgive me for my silence as readily as he might forgive my violence. I think not. I think silence in the face of evil is its own kind of murder. Slower, perhaps, but no less damning." The journal was burned by her daughters, who wanted no record to survive. Some truths, they reasoned, were too dark to preserve. In the Mississippi Delta, where the river runs thick with silt and secrets, old people still tell stories about the plantation with no name. They refuse to speak the actual name, believing it holds power. They tell of a man who loved money more than mercy, who kept ledgers when he should have kept faith, who turned his own blood into currency. They say his ghost walks the river road on Thursday nights, still riding toward that card game, forever unaware of what waits for him in the darkness beneath the oaks. They say the crying heard in those ruins isn't ghosts at all, but the land itself, mourning the innocents buried in its soil. But the real horror of the story isn't supernatural. It's the ordinary evil of it, how a desperate man could construct such systematic cruelty, and how many people helped him by simply choosing not to see. The ledger burned, but the accounting remains. Every society must reconcile with its Marcus Holloways, the men who use law as a weapon, who hide behind social convention while committing the gravest sins. And every society must answer for its Constance, those who know but do not act until far too late. In the archives of fear, we preserve these stories not as entertainment, but as warnings. The monster is rarely the stranger in the darkness. More often, it's the father at the dinner table, the respected businessman, the pillar of the community. And the greatest evil is never the act itself, but the silence of those who witness it and turn away. This concludes our tale. If these archives have disturbed you, then they have served their purpose. Subscribe to Archive of Fear for more stories from America's darkest corners. Tales that remind us that the true horrors are not supernatural, but human.